Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's noon, so I think we'll get started. Thank you for joining us for this month's Lunch and Learn. This month is a little different. Typically, Lunch and Learn viewers are our current school board members, superintendents, business managers. So this one will be a little different in that for the first time, we'll have some non-NDSBA members joining us. So welcome to those of you that I hope are here because you're considering running for your local school board. My name is Alexis Baxley. I serve as the Executive Director of the North Dakota School Boards Association. Joining me today is Amy DeCook. Amy is NDSBA's legal counsel. So today we're going to talk about the process to become a school board member and the work of school board members. We hope many of you will be encouraged to pursue this somewhat challenging, but I think really rewarding work. So we encourage you to ask questions. Amy and I are both pretty casual, so please ask as they come to you. We don't mind that. You don't feel like you have to save them for the end, though we will have time for questions at the end. If you want to ask a question, please either put your question in the Q&A box or click the raise your hand button. Once we're ready to take your question, we will call on you, unmute you, so you can ask the question. If somebody else asks your question and you don't have it anymore, make sure you turn your hand off so that we don't call on you. And then just know that we're not going to be monitoring the chat very closely since we'll be watching those Q&A in hand. So if you put a question in the chat box, we might not get to it. So if it's a really burning question, make sure you use that Q&A. We're going to record today's webinar. We always record our Lunch and Learns, but if you feel like you need to watch it back later or you want to share it with somebody else who might be considering running for school board, it and these slides will be posted on our website, which is www.ndsba.org. It will be under the resources tab, and then we're also live streaming it to our YouTube channel. So we can't link the slides on our YouTube channel, but if you just want to watch the playback with the slides in the playback, you can go and head over to YouTube and watch it there. So like I said, please feel free to share it with anyone that you think will be interested. And then just a reminder that you're all muted for until we unmute you during the webinar. So if you're talking to me and I can't hear you, there's good reason for that. So with that, I think we'll get started. I first just want to say thank you for joining us. Being a school board member has always been a tough job, a job that requires you to learn and know a lot of information and put some time in. But I think it's become even clearer that that is a tough job and a very important job over the last couple of years as we've gone through COVID. So if you're here today in March of 22 because you're learning about being a school board member and it's work you think you want to pursue, thank you. Students of North Dakota need good school board members to support their success. So thank you before we get into anything else. So what are we going to talk about today? First, we're going to talk about who can be a school board member. Then we'll talk about how you become a school board member, expectations for school board members. The big one would be the work of school boards, and then kind of tag teaming with the work of school boards, the limitations of school boards. So we hope that that will cover most of the information that you think you want to know before joining a board. But certainly we could be here for a week and not talk about everything that you might come across in your time as a board member. So please don't hope that this will be all inclusive. So who can be a school board member? Generally, the requirement is that you just must be a qualified elector of the school district that you hope to serve in. What does that mean? It means you have to be 18 years of age or older, right? Old enough to vote. You must reside in the district and maybe the corresponding precinct if that's applicable in your school district for at least 30 days prior to the election. So what do I mean when I say precinct? Many school districts, and Amy, I would probably say most school districts, would that be correct?
Have precincts?
Yeah, well, I would say most school board members are elected at large in most school districts, meaning you are, as long as you live anywhere from the district, you represent the entire district, not a precinct or a subset of the district. However, some districts, particularly reorganized districts, do have precincts. And what that might mean is if you're a reorganized district, you represent multiple towns, multiple areas. Some of your board members maybe have to come from town A and some have to come from town B. Some might be, it might be prescribed that they have to be rural board members. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is you need to live wherever the seat that is open that you are running for prescribes you to live. That might be anywhere in the district. It might be a small portion of the district. And then of course you have to be a US citizen. So all pretty easy, I think. I don't think we usually have 12-year-olds that try to run for the school board. So not a high standard or requirement there, but there are a couple of prohibitions to being a school board member. And Amy, I'll maybe have you talk a little bit about these.
Sure. So one that is kind of has limited applicability is for our districts that are located within the exterior, within the exterior boundaries of a Indian reservation in North Dakota. If they essentially have to correspond with the requirements to run for tribal office when it comes to criminal background. So if your tribal office has some sort of limitation on a criminal conviction, that would also apply to those tribal public school districts as well. So that's one limitation. The other is if the person who is elected to the school board is a current teacher in the district. Our North Dakota Supreme Court has determined that those two positions are incompatible. So if you are a teacher and you want to run for school board, you certainly can run for school board, but if you are elected, you have to choose between the two. You cannot be a teacher and a board in the same district at the same time. Now, there are some questions on whether you can be a substitute teacher or another type of employee. This would also apply to like superintendent principal as well. You can't be those contract employees with the district and also be on the board. But you may have some ability to run or to be on the board if you're a part-time bus driver or part-time cook or something like that. But certainly not a current teacher or a current administrator, that you would be prohibited from holding both of those offices at the same, or positions at the same time.
We do have some situations, though, where we have school board members who live in one district and teach in another, and that's okay. You cannot teach in the district or work in the district that you're a board member, but you can work in another district. So if you're maybe a Bismarck, Mandan, Fargo, West Fargo situation, that is allowed.
Yeah.
Okay, so I see one question already here. What about a part-time teaching such as summer driver's education? Amy, you want to weigh in there?
It doesn't, if you are defined as a teacher under North Dakota law, it would apply across the board. So it doesn't matter if you're part-time or not. If you are a contract teacher in that district, you cannot also be on the board, even if it's temporary or a part-time position. Okay. Good question.
Great question. Yeah. So if you've determined you're eligible to be a board member, how does one become a board member? School districts are required to hold annual elections between April 1st and June 30th. That's likely what we're talking about today. If you're on today, that's probably what we're thinking about. Though sometimes school districts are required to hold special elections, and you may be elected a special election. Again, you may be elected to represent a precinct or a certain area of your district or at large. We talked a little bit about that. And then once you go through the full election process, newly elected board members, if elected at that annual election, take office in July. If you are elected or appointed in some other way, you may take office at another time. But again, for the purpose of today, we're likely talking about annual election and taking office in July. So since we're talking about annual elections, what is the process for that? The first thing that you have to do if you want to run for school board is fill out and file a statement of intent with the business manager in the school district where you're running. They'll also ask you to fill out a statement of interest. And both of those things have to be filed with your business manager 64 days before the election. So you might remember on that last slide, I said anywhere between April and June, generally. School districts can pick their own election date. Most hold their election on that primary Tuesday in June. So that's the date we're going to work with today. Any of our deadlines, that's how we're basing them. But again, do know that your district may have an election on a different date. So you want to confirm that the deadlines that you're working with are correct. And if you look at go and look at these slides after the webinar today, you see at the bottom of this slide in red, I have deadlines for 2022. That will take you to a reference sheet on our webpage that will help you figure out what your district's deadlines are. You also can just call your school district, talk to your business manager. They'll know what their deadlines are and make sure that you get things in the appropriate amount of time. So if we're talking about election day on June 14th, that paperwork has to be filed by April 11th. So you've got a little less than a month to get it done. Once you fill that out, your name, and you put your name on the ballot, you can't take it off after that deadline. So if you think you're going to change your mind, be aware of that deadline. Once the ballots are done and printed, of course, we just have your campaign season and election day. Following election day, the current school board canvasses the votes and declares the results. They have to do that within 13 days after the election. So again, going on that June 14th date, June 27th would be the last date the election results could be finalized. Once that happens, your business manager is going to provide written notice to the folks that won the election. They have to do that within 3 days, so they can't, hold out and not do that. And then if you've been elected, you have to take that oath of office within 10 days after the canvass. So Amy, do you want to talk about that a little bit? I know most of our boards administer that oath of office at their July meeting, but sometimes things happen a little differently.
Sure. So the oath of office can be done in a couple of different ways. Oftentimes when the business manager provides that written notice to the winners of the election within that 3 days from canvass, they oftentimes will send along a written oath of office that the candidate can then essentially fill out and return within 7 days or 10 days, or they can be administered the oath at, by an official at the school district as well. One thing I wanted to clarify on the canvassing date, it has to happen on the 13th day. So we've gotten a lot of questions on that. So I just wanted to make sure we clarified it has to happen on the 13th day. You have no flexibility there. You can't, if it lands, if you don't hold your election on the second Tuesday in June and you hold it on a different day, the 13th day may land on a weekend. Or a weird day, maybe a holiday, you still have to canvass on that 13th day. Just to clarify that.
So what we're saying here is look at your calendars, right? You don't want to be canvassing votes on Father's Day in June or something like that. So
yeah, and when you're setting your election day, if you don't typically hold it the second weekend or the second Tuesday in June, you'll also want to keep in mind some of these other deadlines to make sure it's not going to be inconvenient to meet those deadlines.
Perfect. Great clarification, Amy. Okay, so we talked a little bit on that last slide about your statement of intent and statement of interest. Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about what these are?
Sure. So these two are what we call the candidate filings. If you are interested in running for the school board, you would need to file these two filings with the business manager by 4 p.m. On the 64th day prior to the election. The statement of intent, there is not a one prescribed form. You can essentially write it up yourself as a candidate. We've included an example here from Fargo Public Schools. That's a really good example. The statement of intent basically just says, identifies you and the position that you intend to run for. So it's just a basic statement. The statement of interests, on the other hand, is a prescribed form available from the North Dakota Secretary of State's office. It's a multi-page document, and essentially it just gives it's the information about yourself, your name, your occupation, any business associations that you have, any other types of associations that you have. It essentially gives the voters information about you and your business interests because you'll be running for a public office. Both of these need to be filed again by 4 p.m. On the 64th day prior to the election with the school district business manager. If you don't include these or if they're late, you can't be placed on the ballot as a candidate.
Amy, one question I got this week from someone thinking about running for board was how large or how significant a portion of income a business needed to be included on the statement of interest. And I would say if you think it's a business, if it's a brand new baby business and you haven't had a penny of income from it yet, you still need to include it on that statement of interest form.
I would agree with that. Yes. Alexis, we had a question on the oath. If we want to just take that. Yeah. On the state form, oath of office, it says the oath must be taken and filed on or before the day you begin the duties of your office. Who could we talk to adjust 10 days after the canvass? So the state forms are just that, they're state forms. They're meant to be kind of applicable to all elections within the state. We're talking today about school district elections. So we have specific rules and deadlines for school district elections that may not correspond with statewide elections. And so you always kind of want to be cognizant if you're using state forms that they may not be tailored specifically for school district elections. For school district elections, you are required to take that oath of office within 10 days after canvass. But you also have to do it before you commence your duties. So let's say, for example, there's going to be a board meeting. They want to seat a new board member prior to the expiration of that 10 days. You have to complete the oath of office before you can participate in that meeting as a board member. That's really what that's meant to be. So you kind of have to worry about both. You have to get it within the 10 days of canvass, and you also have to do it before you commence your duties, if those duties are going to commence before that 10-day period is up.
Good question. Okay. So, like I said, we're mainly talking about regular elections, annual elections today, but there are some other ways. You can be appointed to the school board if a vacancy is created sometime during the middle of the year or outside of the election. The sitting school board has the authority to appoint someone to a seat. School district policy differs from school to school on how the board goes about doing that. So if you're looking at an appointed seat, what we would recommend is that you contact your district, contact your business manager, and find out what the board needs you to do to be considered for that position. And then, of course, there are special elections. Those would include recall elections, which can happen at any time, reorganization and elections following a reorganization of a district. We just had one of those up in the Williston-Williams County area. And then filling an empty seat, right? A district may opt to hold a special election to fill an empty seat. In some situations. So you see my two little stars there. If you are appointed or you're filling that empty seat, you're going to finish the remainder of the original term. So we'll talk a little bit what a term talk in a little bit about what a typical term looks like. But if you join the school board in one of these ways, you may not have the typical term. Okay, so you make it through all that, you filled out your paperwork, you had an election, you took your oath of office, now what? Most of our boards in North Dakota have 5, 7, or 9 members. I hesitate to say that there's one default. I would say most of our larger districts are the ones that have those 9-member boards. 5 or 7 is more typical of what I would say the average size North Dakota school is. Again, most terms are 3-year terms. A school district, a school board can opt to convert those 3-year terms to 4. Again, I know Bismarck, Fargo, West Fargo are some districts that have done that. If you've converted those terms to 4 years, you may not have a election every year. It may be every other year. So something to consider and to know about the district that you are in. There is no statutory limit on the number of terms you can serve, so no term limits. You can, if you want to do 20 years of board service and the people will keep electing you for that long, bless you, but you can do it, right? There are no limits. And then compensation, right? I don't know anybody who's run for school board because they think they're going to get rich off of it. But it does differ from school district to school district. So districts have the authority to determine that within reason for themselves. There are some districts in North Dakota where you get a small salary or stipend. Some districts you're paid per meeting, and some districts it is just a volunteer position with reimbursement for expenses when you are working on behalf of the board. So Amy, do you have anything to add on any of those?
No, I think you've covered it. I would say if you are running for a school board that has 4-year terms, those terms are staggered in a way that you only have a school district election that they expire in even numbered years. Now, if they have to fill a vacancy or something, that might call for an election in an odd numbered year, but generally that's going to be the difference. So those are a little bit different. There's not many districts in North Dakota who have that 4-year term, only a few.
No. Okay. Okay, so what are the expectations of board members? It's summed up really neatly here in 6 little bullet points. It might not seem that neat once you get on a board, but of course, monthly meetings. So school boards are required by law to meet once a month all year long. So you are expected to participate in those monthly meetings, and there's often some prep work that you need to do. Your business manager will share with you a board packet, a amount of time, a week or a few days before the board meeting. And all of the best board members spend some time with that packet before the board meeting, familiarizing themselves with the topics, maybe reaching out to their superintendent or business manager to ask clarifying questions if necessary, so that they come to the meeting ready to discuss the things that are on the agenda, ready to make decisions, and familiar with what's going to be taking place that meeting. Monthly meetings are not the only meetings that you will have. You may have special meetings and you'll have committee meetings. Special meetings sometimes are called because something has come up and needs to be dealt with before that next regular meeting. You have special meetings when you work through negotiations, a few different situations. And then many boards have committees to help sort of parse out the work of the board. Common committees are curriculum committees, finance committees, policy committees. And the appointed members of those committees are asked to dig in a little deeper to some of those topics and then make recommendations on behalf of the board. So you may be asked to attend those special and committee meetings as well. And of course, regular attendance is expected of board members. If you do not think that you have the ability to attend all of the meetings expected of you, I'd strongly urge you to consider if this is a position for you. Now, one of the cool things that COVID has brought about is many of our boards are much more comfortable with virtual attendance, phone attendance, and those things are allowed. So if situations come up here and there, right, where you are unable to physically be in the place where the meeting is taking place, you do have other options. But I would really encourage you, if you're going to run for the school board, to really plan and make space for in-person attendance at these board meetings. You're doing important work on behalf of students and on behalf of the public. And I think that work is done better when board members are able to be in person as often as possible. Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about what happens if you are elected and you can't attend regularly?
Yeah, and actually, yeah, I was just about to add that. So it's not uncommon for obviously for things to come up that you weren't expecting. So missing a board meeting here and there, if justified, is that things happen. But one thing to keep in mind is that if you North Dakota law provides that if a board member fails to essentially carry out their duties for 60 consecutive days or more, a vacancy occurs for that seat. So for example, and that's without justification. So if you're undergoing medical treatment and you can't attend, that's justified. So it wouldn't create a vacancy in that case. But if you have a board member who is just not attending meetings for a few months, without justification, that creates a vacancy on the board, and that board member is no longer a board member, and then that would create a vacancy that would need to be filled by the board. So we have kind of that in the law to make sure our elected officials are carrying out the duties for which they were elected to carry out. Yeah, I guess that's all I had to say about the attendance piece.
Perfect. So then, of course, you are expected to declare conflicts of interest, and we'll talk about a little bit more about what conflicts of interest are on another slide. But just know that the requirement and the expectation, right, is that any of those things are declared. Probably the most obvious statement on the slide, you're expected to adhere to applicable laws. School boards are political subdivisions. They're governing bodies made up of elected members that have a large amount of authority within the state of North Dakota, but there are still state, federal, local laws that apply to school districts. I think maybe, I don't want to say more often, but on occasion, we have boards that ask the question, well, what happens if I just don't do that? And there's never a good answer for that other than you put your district at great liability risk to do serious damage to the district, maybe by means of financial penalties, certification, things like that. So please always go into board service with the expectation that you will be following the laws that are applicable. And then, of course, valuing student achievement. We'll talk again a little bit more about that later, but generally when people decide they want to run for school board, there are maybe one or two, maybe three issues that are kind of the prompt for that. They're the spark for wanting to participate. And that's okay, right? We all need those motivating factors. It's important that we care about those things. But once we get on the board, and I'm just going to use probably the age-old but silly example of somebody's mad about a sports coach, and that's what prompts them to say, I'm going to get on the school board. We're going to do something about this, and that's fine. But once you get on the school board, you have to care about all of the things in the district that affect student achievement, because that's why we're there. That's why you're there. And again, I know you probably are like, really, she's got to tell us this, but it's so important that it's worth the reminder, I think. Okay, so I said we'd talk a little bit about conflict of interests. You guys get to see my recycled Fox and the Hen House cartoon. What you need to know is that conflict of interest is referenced twice in North Dakota Century Code in ways that are applicable to school board members. So you don't need to memorize those citations, but you'll just know that one reference, the 15.1 reference, is what specifically applies to school board members, school districts. It's in the school section of code. That reference is a more specific limitation. In order for something to be a conflict of interest under this section, there has to be an expenditure of funds or a financial gain loss type situation. So an example of that might be one of those businesses that you own that you filed or you included on your statement of interests has the potential to do business with the school district, so you would benefit financially. Before the board approves that contract or approves that business, you would need to declare, right, that you own that business or that you would benefit financially from that business. And, you know, I know we talk about this with a lot of our board members, particularly in small towns. Everybody knows you own that business, right? We know you. I know Amy. I know, you know, what she does for a living, all of those things. It doesn't matter. You have, even if everybody already knows, to meet the letter of the law, you have to declare it in a board meeting for the minutes, for the public to be aware, because not everybody in the public might know. So if you violate that conflict of interest section, there is a penalty, a Class A misdemeanor penalty. But again, you can avoid that so long as you disclose it and the board consents to you participating in that discussion. Just because it's a conflict doesn't mean you can't participate. You just have to declare it. And then the other reference, the more general reference, this is the one that applies to all public officers in the state of North Dakota. So it would be applicable to your county commissioners, your city council, legislators, that type of thing. It's more general. It does not require an expenditure of funds. So that's important to note because I think this is probably the more common situation, especially for board members who may have students in the school, who may have family members who work somewhere in the district. You know, you can't be a teacher, but your wife can be a teacher. We have a board member on our NDSBA board whose mom, I believe, is the lead negotiator for the teachers and whose sister-in-law is a principal in the district. So, you know, it's pretty tough for him to not have a conflict of interest when it comes to negotiations or things like that. But again, those things don't prohibit you from participating. You just need to declare it, and your fellow board members need to consent in your participation. Now, the one question that we get often is, well, how far does the connection for a conflict of interest go, right? What's a family member or what's a conflict of interest relationship? And state law doesn't specify that. But generally what I tell my new board members in training is that if you think it might be, or if you think it might be perceived as a conflict of interest, just declare it. It doesn't hurt to declare it. For sure, anything that has to do with spouse, children, immediate family members, but we all know in North Dakota that sometimes, you know, you can have a second cousin who's like a sister to you. Just declare it. You lose nothing by declaring, and, you know, potentially save yourself a lot of headache. And I see a question here. How long does the declaration of conflict last? Do you need to do it annually? I would say you need to do it, Amy, every time you discuss it or make a decision. You can't fill out a conflict of interest form at the start of the year. You need to do it during every discussion so the public that's participating is aware of that conflict at that moment. Would you agree, Amy?
I would agree with that. You know, one caveat to that potentially has to do with contract negotiations. So when you're negotiating with your teachers, it's a process. You have multiple meetings. If you have one very common example is a board member who has a spouse that is a teacher for the district, that is a conflict under 15.10717 that we have referenced on the screen. You should declare that you could declare that conflict at the outset of the negotiations process, and the board can deal with it for the entire process, decide how they want to consent to you participating in that process. Or every time an issue during the negotiations process comes before the board, you can declare the conflict and the board can decide kind of by, you know, each point in time how it wishes to deal. That's probably the only caveat. Otherwise, every time an issue comes in front of the board, even again, if everybody knows that you have a spouse that works for the district, you still need to declare it and follow the procedure to participate in the discussion and vote. I will say that, you know, I think NDSBA encourages our boards to consent when a conflict has been properly declared. There may be a few exceptions to that, but you know, you should be, the law provides a process to participate. And for the most part, you should allow your fellow board members to participate, especially if you feel that they, you know, can act in the best interest of the district despite that conflict. The whole point is to bring it to light so that everybody is aware, you know, hey, I have this conflict under the law. I would like to still participate in the discussion and vote, and hopefully the board will allow for that in most circumstances.
Okay, Amy, I see we have another maybe question. Nora Ahmed has her hand raised. Their hand raised. You are, I believe you should be able to unmute, Nora. Nora, did you still have a question?
No, sorry.
No problem. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on. We're going to talk a little bit about ethics for school board members. We'll go over this a little bit quickly, but know that there is no declaration of ethics for board members in North Dakota law, but each district may have adopted a policy defining what ethical behavior for board members look like. So if you become a board member, one of the first things you probably want to do is review some district policies, and I would put this towards the top of the list. It just will define what the expected allowable behavior is of a board member. So generally it's golden rule stuff, right? It's what we teach our kindergarten kids. Be respectful of fellow board members, staff, the public, always act in best interest of the district, follow the chain of command, which is something, you know, you'll learn about from a school district perspective if you become a board member. Act with integrity and honesty. This is an important one, following policy. School districts and school boards are governed by a lot of policies, some of those required by state and federal law. And probably one of the more common ethical issues is board members acting outside of policies that they've adopted and approved. And you can put your district at some certain liability risk when you do that. And then of course, working as a team, right? Unethical behavior, promoting a personal agenda, right? Don't just get on the board to work on that one single issue. Micromanaging staff, we'll talk about what that looks like later. Violating trust. I'm going to loop that in with the last one of not maintaining confidentiality, right? There are situations as a board member where you will become privy to confidential information that is a violation of law if you share that information, whether intentionally or unintentionally. And that includes your spouse and your children. You're expected to maintain that confidentiality. Other unethical behavior, again, using the office for personal gain or attacking others in public. When you get on a school board, nobody expects you to agree with every decision the school board makes or have the exact same opinion as every other board member. What makes local boards great is that they represent multiple perspectives from the district they represent. But what we don't want is that disagreement to bubble over into arguments or character, you know, attacks on people's character or confrontations in public. Have those discussions and those disagreements at the board table, make decisions, and then move on. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities, the work of the board. The most important thing when it comes to roles and responsibilities is figuring out what is the job of a board member versus the job of other district leadership, being your superintendent or your business manager. We like to tell boards that there are 4 areas of board leadership: vision, structure, accountability, and advocacy. Where you should be leading a district is setting a vision for the district. What are the goals? What's your long-term plan? Creating structure to achieve those goals and that vision. You might do that through policy, through budget, different things. Accountability. Are you assessing the work the district is doing on a regular basis to ensure that you are moving in a direction that will achieve those goals and vision? Or do you need to pivot and make some adjustments? And then, of course, advocacy. Advocacy for your district, advocacy for your students, advocacy for your staff. So within those 4 areas of leadership, we like to say that there are the 5 big jobs of a school board, right? If you go into Century Code, you will see a whole long list. I think it's a whole page long, maybe longer, of powers granted to school boards. And that's true, that's accurate. But the reality is you delegate much of that authority through policy. And it really kind of whittles down to these 5 big things that you do. The first is, again, that vision area. Adopt a vision and goals. So you should be adopting a strategic plan or goals for your school district for student achievement. You should be doing a 3 and 5 year plan. You should be doing facilities planning, all of the vision and oversight stuff that a governing body should do. And then, of course, evaluating the progress towards those goals. If the structure you put into place either does not empower your employees or your district to help students, for example, achieve those goals, you may need to pivot and change. And if you're not regularly evaluating your progress, you won't know that. Setting policy. Again, we talked a little bit before about all of those policies that govern a district. It is your job as a board member to determine and approve those policies. Many of them are pretty prescriptive if they're required by law, but some of them, like school dress codes or, Amy, what's a good example of a very subjective policy for a district? Put you on the spot here.
Subjective policy. Well, like leave policies are pretty subjective.
That's a great example, right? So each district has the authority to set their own staff leave policy. So it's your job as the board to determine what that policy is going to be and adopt it. Number 3, hire and evaluate a superintendent, right? Your superintendent is your educational expert. They lead your staff. They lead the district. Hiring the right superintendent and cultivating a good, trusting relationship with that superintendent is very important. There are a lot of studies that show the quality of that relationship between a superintendent and a board has a large effect on how well your students do. Job 4, of course, approve a budget. As elected officials, it is your job to approve that budget, levy the taxes necessary for that budget, and then, of course, convey all of that to the community. Now, if you get elected as a board member, we'll have a lot more discussions about what your role is in communicating and interacting with the community. But at the end of the day, you do represent the community. And so you want to be a positive reflection of the district and find appropriate ways to share the work of the board and the work of the district with the community. And then, of course, all of those things are done with a hope that you are going to impact student achievement, right? You might think that, well, setting a budget doesn't probably have a lot to do with 4th grade math scores, but you should be setting your budget in a way that supports and prioritizes the things that impact student achievement. So if you're setting goals for student achievement, adopting policies to help empower your district staff to coach students to those goals. You also should then have a superintendent that's going to lead your district in that direction and a budget that's going to support that work. So each of those 5 things may seem somewhat separate, but they should be done with those goals for student achievement and for your community in mind. Okay, Amy, do you want to talk a little bit about, kind of these specific roles and responsibilities? I don't want to spend too much time going into each area, but I think it's just an important example of where the board role always lies and where the superintendent role lies.
Yeah, and I would say that this appropriately understanding the roles and responsibilities of the school board versus administration is probably a key to establishing a trusting, well-oiled working relationship between the board and administration, which, as Alexis said, is kind of key to a well-functioning district and high student achievement. So we provide this information to a lot of our member districts. These are kind of the 10 general areas. And then it breaks down how the school board versus the superintendent, what roles they play and what responsibilities they have in a given area. So for example, policy is kind of a good example, I think, to use. It's number 2 on the left-hand side. But basically for policy, the school board adopts the policy, sets the policy, and the superintendent may make suggestions on what policy should say, but is ultimately responsible for implementing the policies set by the board and monitoring compliance with the policies. So the whole point here is that the school board has a role and a responsibility in these given areas, and then the superintendent has their roles and responsibilities, and kind of staying in your lane in these areas. And there's probably more than these, but generally speaking, kind of staying in your appropriate role and undertaking your responsibilities and allowing the counterpart to do theirs. Really breeds a well-functioning district, and so we kind of hammer this into our board members and our administrators because it really does bode well to establishing that solid relationship between the two. So another good example is labor relations, and that's kind of a broad thing, but ultimately the school board under North Dakota law has the power to employ all school district personnel. But what ends up happening in reality is that the school board kind of sets the guidelines for hiring, approves contracts if it's a contractual employee. But at the end of the day, the superintendent and administration kind of handle the screening process, for example, makes recommendations for hiring to the board, maybe makes decisions in terms of day-to-day personnel issues, and then monitors personnel issues to make sure that they're complying with policy. And if you stay in your lane on those things, it really bodes well for a good working relationship. We have this kind of tag on the side of this list that the school board does not run the school; it sees that they were run well. So basically, again, the role of the school board is to set the vision, set the policy, set the standards, and then essentially hand over the management of that to your superintendent and your other administrators to run the day-to-day operations of the district.
Yeah, I think that's a good clarification, Amy. If you look at the middle and the right-hand column on that sort of matrix, you will see that everything in the board is adopting, providing guidelines, monitoring, right? It's that sort of 30,000-foot view where when you get over to the superintendent, they're the ones in the detail work that is the implementing of those policies or those guidelines.
And this is really recommendations, best practices to have a well-oiled, well-functioning district. There may be times where those roles have to shift a bit because you have special circumstances, but overall, all districts should generally function this way. Some of our large districts have some different governance models, but even in those governance models, it largely fits into this kind of this matrix and this idea of how to govern and these various roles and responsibilities.
I would agree with that, Amy. And one other note before we move on from this slide, we do have a resource. We call it our School Board Member Toolkit. It's available on our website under the resources page. And it spends a significant number of pages talking about roles and responsibilities and micromanaging. So if this is something you're really looking to dig in on more than we have time for today, I would encourage you to go to that toolkit and give it a read. I do see one question, Amy. When the new board is implemented, is it typical to revisit and set goals and vision? And I would say it depends on the district. Each district, if they're doing this work as they should be, may be doing it on their own schedule. You may not automatically start with a brand new set of goals each time you have a new board, but you may have a process in place where you review it. You review it a certain portion each month, or you review it every 6 months. It just would depend on the process of the district.
One thing I would mention in that too, one of the things that we've been doing at NDSVA is really encouraging our boards to have a robust superintendent evaluation process. Part of that superintendent evaluation process should be setting goals, district-wide goals, as well as, maybe professional development goals for the superintendent specifically. Now, we only recommend setting a few goals per year, but part of that superintendent evaluation process is setting goals for the district as well. So that we encourage to do on a yearly basis. So that might be something, if you're interested in setting goals, to do that in conjunction with your superintendent evaluation process.
Good comment, Amy. So if we talked about what is the work of boards, what isn't the work of boards? And these are just a few examples of those things that get into that day-to-day work, micromanaging of your staff, right? As Amy said, technically you have the authority to be hiring school staff, but really the bulk of that should be delegated to your superintendent and your principals. You should only, as a school board, be hiring the superintendent and the business manager. You should not be involved in day-to-day student discipline, right? I know that last bullet, parent complaints, sometimes makes it hard to be not involved in some of those, but there's really great reasons for you to not be involved in student discipline, even outside of the fact that you've hired staff to do that. You are employing people that is their job. Same with staff reprimands, complaints, or evaluations. Now, when I say staff evaluations, I do not mean superintendent or business manager. Your board should be evaluating your superintendent and business manager. You should not have any part in evaluating or disciplining staff other than those two individuals. You should not be a part of the sort of day-to-day operational decisions. And what I mean by that, just kind of a low-hanging fruit example of deciding when to close school when the roads are bad, right? There are a lot of those day-to-day things that it's sometimes easy for board members to take part in because I don't know if it's interesting, but it's easy. It's not the difficult nature of some of the board work. And so there's sometimes a want to kind of get our fingers in that cookie jar. And then parent complaints. If you become a board member, you'll hear all about the chain of command and how to send parent or constituent community complaints and where to send them. But at the end of the day, the reason that we don't want you should not be involved in that student discipline, in staff evaluations, in handling community complaints is because of the big difference between school boards and other governments, other local political subdivisions, and private business. In other local political subdivisions, private businesses, you deal with those staff issues. There are different employment rights and rules than public schools deal with. And because of those different continuing contract rights, the board ends up essentially serving as judge and jury anytime a student needs to be disciplined in a certain way, expelled. Anytime you may need to non-renew or discharge a staff member, you are the final appeal for those individuals. And so just like our juries in other matters, you want them to be objective and, not not privy to the details or biased, you as a board need to be out of those details in order to be objective. And if it comes to light that you were not objective, you were privy to many of those details, students, teachers often have cause to sue if they feel they didn't get a fair hearing. So we don't just tell you to stay out of that because we don't want you to micromanage. That's true. But we also want to protect your district from the liability that that brings with it. Okay, I see one question, Amy, and I think I'm going to save that one for the end because we're close here just to make sure we get through it all. We're running out of time. So last slide here, potential repercussions if you find yourself doing things that you shouldn't be, meaning unethical behavior, micromanaging, not declaring conflicts, things like that. The first one is censure. A board can vote to censure its members. Really, that is just a public expression of disapproval of your actions or behavior. A board may have a policy that allows them to remove fellow members from leadership positions or committee assignments if they feel that their behavior has warranted it. And again, like we just talked about, you can create liability for the district. I can't say it happens all of the time, but it happens often enough that I want you to be aware of it. We have had a couple of situations since, Amy and I have been on board where we've had to answer phone calls and questions from criminal investigators about board behavior because, the public does take these things seriously and so does law enforcement. And then the last one I have here is personal liability ? I've gotten a question a couple of times, and it's maybe because we're a rural area with lots of farmers and ranchers with land, different assets, but wondering if, the district were to be sued, is there personal liability? And generally the answer is no. In your volunteer position, your personal assets are not subject to confiscation or that type of thing if the district is sued. But I say it depends because there is some personal liability if your behavior is the item that has created the issue. So if you do not follow conflict of interest laws, right? And you benefit financially, there is that Class A misdemeanor. You will can be held personally liable for that. That may involve different penalties. And I can't say what a judge would enforce. I've heard things about paying back financial amounts, right? Different issues. So just know that, you're not totally off the hook. If you're behaving the way you should be, you have nothing to worry about. So on that very positive note, right, I'm just going to ask if there are any more questions and take a look at the couple that we do have here. This must be from a current board member or business manager. Says, observe superintendent evaluation and policy changes were approved and newly implemented this month. Amy, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that has to do with the previous question about setting goals and vision. It's going to vary from district to district. I would say it's probably not incredibly common to set an overall vision every year or frequently throughout the year, but it is incredibly common to do policy changes and updates throughout the school year. We at NDSBA send out updates and stuff is kind of changing, is ongoing and changing all of the time. So there's nothing really to be suspicious or worried about if they're making policy changes or maybe even setting goals. We are always encouraging our boards to set goals. So we're happy to hear that they're doing it. And if they do it in the middle of a school year, that must be a timing that works for them. And there's nothing that is inherently improper about that by any means. So yeah, I think there's nothing weird about that in my view.
I would agree. And then how are committees decided and or positions assigned? Are committees reformed after election. So I think we'll take the last question first and say yes. When you have new board members appointed, you in your July organizing meeting, you're going to appoint those committees, choose board leadership. And then I would just say, it depends on the district. You may outline that process a little differently. But of course, your board is going to elect your leadership. Your president is elected by the fellow board members. And then, Amy, I believe in most districts, board presidents are going to appoint those committees, correct?
Yes, they appoint them, but ultimately the board approves those appointments. So
Good point.
yeah, so the board president is kind of charged, and this is generally reflected in board policy. It's not found in the law, but in board policy, it generally delegates the work of appointing and are essentially nominating committee members to the board president, and then the board ultimately approves those appointments. So yeah, it might vary from district to district. That's generally how it works.
Okay, I would say maybe one more question if there is one, but I won't wait too long. Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking your lunch hour to spend with us. We appreciate your interest in board service. I hope that we didn't scare you away from it today. It is a time commitment. There is a lot to learn, but I know most board members that I know will say that it is some of the most rewarding most rewarding work that they've done. So if you have more questions, I would encourage you to contact your own business manager. They're going to be able to tell you about elections and board service in your district. If you want to know about what it's really like from somebody that might give you the unpolished version, reach out to board members in your district or board members that you know personally. They can offer insight that Amy and I can't. And then if you have any questions based on what you heard today, give Amy or I a shout. We'd be happy to answer your questions and take a look at those resources we mentioned on our website. So with that, have a great day. Thank you for joining us. If you are somebody who participates in our webinars regularly, please stay tuned. We're probably going to have some scheduling changes to Lunch and Learns coming up. So watch your emails for that information. And then remember that today this was recorded. It's available at ndsba.org on resources and on our YouTube page. So with that, have a great afternoon. Thanks, everybody.